Hello and welcome to MBA Waves. We are on the air. MBA Waves is the live, interactive, almost podcast talking all things MBA, streaming on now LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. So we're growing. MBA Waves is founded by MBA and GMAT coaching professionals who consult and coach people seeking entry into the powerful world of MBA holders. I'm Eric Lucrezia, your moderator for today, joined by two guests, including my fellow co-founder, Bara Sapir and Andrea Spari. Bara, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm CEO of City Test Prep. I hail from the East Coast, but I'm living in San Francisco, Bay Area. And we help students maximize their scores on standardized tests, the EA, the GRE, the GMAT. And it's great to see everybody this morning.
Thanks, Bara. And today's guest is Andrea Spari, who is the founder of Spari Consulting Group, joining us from, I think, Seattle. And Andrea, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks. And thanks so much for including me today, guys. I'm really excited to be here. My name's Andrea Spari. I founded Spari Consulting Group almost 15 years ago now, and the company has come with me from the East Coast, Bara in New York, to San Diego, now Seattle. My roots are in Canada. And I love talking about interview prep with folks. So I'm really thrilled to be here.
Fantastic. Thank you. And thank you for joining us today. Once again, my name is Eric Lucrezia. I am the former director of recruitment for the Global MBA program at ESSEC Business School here in Paris and in Singapore. And I am the founder of Candidate Coach. I also work with clients who are applying for MBA programs all around the world. And today we're going to talk about interviewing, as it is. We're in the midst of round 2 interviews, especially for a lot of the North American MBA programs. So I think it's a very pertinent topic. So here's how to prepare. We're going to dive into why the interview is such an important part of the process and some tips and suggestions to help you be organized and prepared. So as we go, either one of you can respond to questions at any point. And, oh no.
What's going on?
All right. Oh, I've popped out.
You're muted now. Eric, you're muted.
Hello? All right, we got to fix this first.
I love technology. I don't know about you, Bara. I do know that you work with people who deal with anxiety all the time, but there's nothing to me that triggers anxiety, I think, more than when technology does not work for me.
Yeah, I've learned when technology doesn't work that I just think, who can I delegate this to immediately so that I don't freak out? And I have names of people that I can just call on speed dial. So
that's wonderful.
Yeah.
I think we're back.
So let me ask you, can you hear me now? There's still an echo. All right, hold on, we're going to fix this.
If we're imaginative, it does sound like birds at a sanctuary.
He's going to try sign back on.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, as we're taping, you and I can talk a little bit about just, what role does the interview actually place? Like, how important is the interview in the entire MBA application process?
That's a question, Bara, that I get all the time from folks, and the amazing answer that is also useless is that it depends. Mm-hmm. Each school places a different weight on the interview, and so when I'm talking with folks, I have told them to imagine that they've already put their best foot forward. They're over a line. This is just another opportunity to give your best. And so the time that they spend worrying about how important the interview is actually time that they take away from their own prep. There's just a lot of worry, I think, and consideration about that. What I would say is that candidates don't go into the interview on an equal playing field from my experience. There are some who that we would look at and honestly say are almost a slam dunk candidate, right? They've got all kinds of attributes. Their role in an interview is to make sure that they give their best, but also to not, honestly, to not mess up a great candidacy that they've already prepared. There are other people who have been given interviews for different reasons, and the importance of the interview to them might be significantly different. So even school to school, it's different, but for candidates of different backgrounds, it can also be pretty different too.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what about, are the interviews in the different rounds different, or is that not relevant?
Well, one of the things that's been interesting in as everyone is getting back to varying degrees of normalcy, right, post COVID, is how interviews are changing in terms of who's conducting them. At the schools, alums have, for some schools, have remained engaged the entire time and done them by Zoom. In other cases, alums have not played a role where it's been more reliant on students for the last couple of years, and alums are coming back into the process. That's certainly been a change. I think it's also exciting for candidates in a few cases to have been back on campus for interviews. That's starting very slowly for some schools, but it's exciting to see that for people because I think they have a different feeling when they actually get to be in person versus Zoom. But I know the convenience of Zoom, gosh, has been so great for so many people.
Right. The excitement of leaving one's home, right?
Yeah.
The excitement of leaving one's front door to the outdoors. That.
Exactly.
So might as well ask, can you guys hear me correctly now?
We can.
That's fantastic. I think I figured out our little tech issue. I was appearing on two different windows at once, and there was some reverb, which was pretty horrible, and I apologize to everyone for that. So, as you guys were talking about some of the different possibilities for interviews, whether it's a student, either a current or a former student, therefore alumni interviewing versus professional staff, that's one thing to look at.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you're doing it individually or in a group, or it's in person or online, like you guys just mentioned, there's a few different variables that I think are worth mentioning. So I don't know, maybe Andrea, did you want to talk about maybe how it might be different with an alumni versus staff?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one of the things that I've noticed over the last few years is the drive towards standardization for schools to make sure that candidates have an equal shot. And so if it's a school that has alumni and students and admissions staff that are conducting the interview, and it could be any of those three, you are likely going to expect a more standard interview with a standard list of questions to make sure, again, to try and create a more equitable interview experience than maybe has been there in the past. If you're interviewing with a student or an alum versus the admissions staff, the biggest difference that I see is the importance of preparing questions that are appropriate for the person that you're meeting with. So if you're meeting with a student, and especially if you find out maybe they're a first-year student, and you don't want to ask questions about maybe some of the elective classes or things like that that they haven't had a chance to experience yet. If it's an alum, you may not want to ask a really specific detail about the school because it may be something that's changed since they were there. If it's an admissions staff person, I think one of the most important things is not to underestimate their involvement in the program. So sometimes people will come and say, yeah, but they haven't been a student, so what can I actually ask them about? The benefit is that they've seen thousands of students usually go through the program. They can offer some great context for you. So it's making sure that you really prepare thoughtful questions is one of the biggest differences, actually, that I find.
Definitely. Bara, anything to add there, or?
No, I think that covers things.
I mean, to sum it up, I would say just know your audience, right? Think about who you're speaking to, what would be appropriate, and tailor or customize the questions that you want to ask to them. Individual versus group. One of the things I think Andrea was already touching upon, but just to rehash about, is like you want to give equitable time, or just pay attention to how much time other people are speaking to gauge how much you should be participating in. You want to participate and make your voice heard, but also not be grandstanding or dominating the conversation. That doesn't actually play out well for you. And for some people who might be more timid or who might be more type A, you might have to think about the natural reflexes you have. And then, of course, online versus in person, right? In person has all the advantages, like Barra said, stepping out of your house finally and having some human contact.
Mm-hmm.
But online has some advantages too. You just really have to pay attention to some key things, as we've seen this evening about tech issues, having a good internet connection and minimizing any distractions, like either behind you or kids or cats or whatever running around. Trying to make eye contact and thinking about lighting and camera angle and all that stuff can play into the comfortableness and therefore success of the interview. So that said,
do you mind if I jump in with a quick point on that in particular when it pertains to the groups? One of the things that we have the most fun with is the Wharton group interview prep that we get to do with some students, and some of our colleagues send students over as well to work on them. One of the most terrible and most awesome things that we can offer with feedback is to take randomly timed screenshots and then show people what their faces look like when they are on Zoom in a group discussion. You can do the same thing for yourself if you're doing individual interview prep.
I'm doing it to you right now, just so you know.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. And I appreciate the heads up. One of the things we always tell people, we reassure them that those screenshots are being jettisoned the moment we're done with the feedback portion. No one else will see them. But it's so important because in a group discussion, or even when you're engaging one-on-one, your facial expressions convey so much more than they might even in an in-person context, because the person's looking at your entire body language. When you kind of consist of this up, it's really just your face that they're often looking at. And so we have a little trick with bright, this is much brighter than it looks on camera, but bright sticky notes, and it goes up beside the camera for people to say, and literally just has the word smile on it.
Nice.
Because it's amazing. You can smile at a lot of things, right? It doesn't have to be a forced thing, but it brings it up in conversation. I find it's really effective. Bara, you probably have a ton of insight into why that trick might actually help people to feel calmer during interviews too, because this is a pretty stressful thing for people.
Well, the amazing thing about smiles is that it's probably the most contagious facial expression that we inhabit. And so when we smile, whoever we're smiling at, they automatically have a response of smiling back. So it's a really great way to gain attunement with whoever it is that you're talking to. And it's so interesting that you bring up this point too, because I often will watch, when I'm watching the news, I'm always amazed at how the broadcaster is looking into the camera and really creating that rapport with me, with whomever it is they're looking at. But when the camera pulls out and you see, they're just looking into a camera. So this is something that people do professionally. This is something that people have had practice. It's not something it's a skill. And so to just assume that because we're used to talking to other people, that we're going to be able to be comfortable and at ease, having that smile is actually a brilliant way of that engagement, of getting people.
Connection. It's all about connection.
It's about connection, for sure.
I like that tip about the Post-it as well. There's a trick I use as well, because when you're doing these Zoom calls, very often you're looking at the person's face that you're talking to. Normal. That's what you're supposed to do in a human conversation, but it's not exactly the same. There's a little bit of, there's a gap between reality and what we're doing on camera here. So instead of looking at the person's face, or often we're looking at our own face, we're checking our hair, do we look ridiculous, all that kind of stuff. Stare into that camera. So I actually use a little Post-it note with an arrow pointing right at the camera. When I'm doing, that kind of stuff, really important stuff to really make sure I'm focusing on that camera lens. Of course, during these Zoom things, these MBA Waves things, I'm moving between screens with questions and so on. It's not as easy, but I wanted to get into some specific, like concrete things that people can do to prepare, some specific tips.
Yeah.
about, how to prepare for the questions. Obviously you're there in the interview to speak about your accomplishments. You want to come armed with examples or even like a portfolio of your work, perhaps. But you definitely want to use your CV or resume, depending where you're from, as you call it, as sort of a springboard for conversation and be ready to go into much more depth. CVs are limited to a page, maybe two. Essays have a word count. Your interviews, your chance to shine. And if you're ever given the option, if you're told it's an optional thing to do the interview, I would always go for it because it's about making that human connection. And above all, what I find myself saying the most is you are interviewing them just as much as they are interviewing you. So you should want to speak with these people. You should want to know as much as possible before you make that very important and expensive choice of where you're going to business school and making that investment. Ladies, anything you wanted to add to those points?
When we talk with folks about preparation, there's a couple of things that are really difficult for people, but really, really important, I think. One is practicing out loud. We have a lot of muscle memory in our mouth, just like we do in all of our other body parts. So for anyone who's been an athlete, if you do something 1,000 times, gosh, it starts to feel more comfortable. I would never suggest practicing a question for an interview 1,000 times, but it does help, I find, to go through things in threes. The first one is often terrible. The second practice is much improved, but you start to figure out some things you would want to adjust. And it's not to memorize answers to things, but it's for your mouth to start to feel comfortable in what you might articulate when things come up. So that out loud practice, especially doing it on video, so awkward. It is I still remember having to do that in my MBA years ago. It was on a VHS tape, of course. So that's how old I am. But watching that back is really painful, but it also shows you all of the things you really want to improve. So that's one. The second thing that's often more difficult for people is to practice the weakness or failure or setback or disappointment questions. We're really good about talking about our accomplishments, I think. Some of us may be better than others in terms of your confidence level, but the weaknesses and failures, gosh, those are difficult. And we tend to shy away from, I think, answering those. If you can come into an interview and own the heck out of mistakes that you've made or a failure that has taught you something, it conveys a totally different sense of confidence. So those are the two things. There's loads of other things that you can practice, but if there's two, it would be doing whatever you do out loud instead of writing it down, and also focusing on those negatives as well, or perceived negatives that are actually our best learning usually.
100%. And not only just talking about your negatives. Oh, I'm sorry, Barra. I was just going to say that, like, following that up quickly with what you've learned from that, how you've grown, how you've improved. It's not just like, I'm always late to work and leave it there. Like,
that's a great example. Yep.
If that is the example that you have a little bit trouble with time management, talk about how you make up for it in other ways. Talk about how you've gotten better over the years. Talk about how you deliver in other areas, and that's just not just a bomb that you've not cleaned up the mess afterward from.
Right. Absolutely.
Barry, what were you going to say? I'm sorry.
I was going to also say, getting into the weeds here, that regionally or culturally, the way that we ask questions is different. Right. So some people might ask a question and they go up at the end. Right. They might say, well, how are you feeling? Or whereas other people will go down, and being able to be aware of how you sound and how you want to sound and move towards how you want to sound. I don't know if there's always a better way, but I would imagine modulating it so that it's not always one way, so that you're always going up is probably better. And having that recording will at least alert you to who you are when you ask questions and how you are perceived, because the way our tone works, and I think that that's probably very important in the interview to some extent, even if it's an unconscious thing.
Something I've heard a lot when I was a kid, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. And that was more in the context of me being told by my parents how they wanted to be spoken to. But
you remember that lesson.
Yeah. But there's so much truth to it. And thanks, Mom. But there's something I think it's called varied speech. And it's about how to make people interested in listening to you by varying your pace, your tone of voice, going up, going down, more neutral. Also pauses. And sometimes silence can be really poignant. Volume, speaking really loud when you want to make an emphatic point, or actually sometimes speaking softly and slowing down has just the same impact. So it's a topic I'd love to explore maybe in a future episode. But all of these things play into what Barra was saying very much in the delivery of what you say and keeping them engaged. Because if they're engaged in your interview, they're going to see that you're going to be an engaging leader and going to be great in the program and great in your future job. So all of this is kind of a simulation for your future reality. Okay. What else? Anything else in terms of like some specific things that could prepare? And after, if not, I'm going to move on to the next point. Just let me know.
The only thing I want to just quickly say is that yeah, as Andrew was speaking about this, it's really a lot like dating, right? It's a lot like dating. So Eric, you had said you're not only being interviewed, you're interviewing them. So going in, I think it's a really great confidence booster, knowing that you're at choice, right? You have agency. So you are empowered. You are an active participant in this, and you are interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you, and that it is like a dance and it is like dating. So, that might temper people's nerves a little bit.
I really like that. And it speaks to what your expertise is, Barra. I do want to have a little caveat to that, the phrase or the concept of you're interviewing them just as much as they're interviewing you. Yes, but they are the business school who have invited you. They are the lead in the dance, and they have the upper hand.
And don't date them. Don't go on a date with them.
Yeah.
Thank you for that reminder. That's very helpful.
I'm not even going to get into gender roles. Just leave that alone. But they're the lead in the sense that you want to defer to them. Like if it's an in-person thing, don't just sit down. Ask them to invite you for a seat. Don't just rock up with a coffee. They'll probably offer you one. You can jump with water. I think water is the one thing that's totally neutral and normal, and probably a good idea if you're getting nervous to wet your whistle. But yeah, defer to them. Same thing with like the conclusion of the interview. We're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but like depending on where you are, probably a handshake is the most common thing, but let them offer their handshake first, kind of thing. Some cultures you might be used to bowing. Here in France, kissing, but we don't really kiss in an interview. So like if you're coming to interview in a French school, don't like lean in for a kiss with your interviewer because that's probably weird. Standard handshake is normal. A firm, but couple pumps and then move on.
Eric, one of the things I was going to add is that I think there's a bit of a distinction in the middle part of the interview around this dance concept, depending on the school. So some schools, it is decidedly their dance. So I often talk with people about whether they have ever been in a dance class, and we do jettison gender roles, for the purposes of the conversation, whether I'm doing prep with a man or a woman, they are the woman in a traditional dance relationship, right? From very traditional ballroom dance, for example, and where the school, in some cases, they lead, it's their deal. You are not trying to assert your agenda at all. If you do, it's weird and awkward. With other schools, they expect you to take the lead. So they will tee up a question for you, but it's going to be your dance and you're taking them where you want them to go. And that's where it's really important, whether it's with a coach, with an alum, with someone, make sure you understand the format of the interview for that school to really ascertain that dance role in particular. So beginning and end, absolutely their dance. In the middle, I think it depends on the school.
There's latitude, there's room for, and it also might depend on the person with whom you're interviewing at the same school. You might have multiple interviews. Again, it could be an alum and staff. It might one with a professor, career services. So, you have to keep that in mind. Individual personalities are a factor in this. Okay, really good stuff. Thank you, guys. So a lot of people stress about what exactly they're going to ask. They want to know the questions, and you can see all these posts on Reddit and lots of places where people will share the questions they've been asked, or they'll just like postulate, what are they going to ask me? And I kind of want to transmit the idea that you already know all of the questions that they'll ask, and you have all the answers. It's just about decoding what they want to really know. And basically they want to know about your experiences and abilities I have this like breakdown of the 6 areas that I talk about. They want to know if you're going to be a good fit in this school, in this program, and be a fantastic example as an alum. And those areas are teamwork, leadership, international experiences, your tenacity, your problem solving abilities, and community. And that last one is a little bit confusing for people, but I kind of mean like getting along with other people, building relationships, being humble, but also knowing how to take the lead, all that kind of stuff are those 6 areas that I find that if you really break it down, what the questions are trying to get at, what the root is of those questions, it's those areas. So what I often recommend people doing when I'm working with clients is to, for each of those categories, think of things that you can talk about. Have a look at your CV or your resume. Think about experiences that are not on there. Just thinking back on some of the things you've achieved, some things that you've experienced throughout your career, and make lists, and then start practice talking about them. As we've been saying earlier in this talk, I think it's great to do it with a friend. Have somebody ask you the questions, you could respond to them. It feels a little bit more organic. Working with a coach, obviously, that's what we all do. Another option is in front of a mirror, and perhaps even better, filming yourself. And that could be really awkward, especially when you go back and look at yourself. I know it's like cringeworthy. Back in the 90s when we had answering machines, like hearing your own voice was like the most cringeworthy thing. But guess what? You're going to see how you react on camera. You're going to see some of the things you might do when you're either lost in thought, feeling nervous, don't know what to say. And maybe you can taper some of that body language that you might not want to do during an interview and get a handle on it in advance. It's all about practice. So I'll just repeat that list again. Teamwork, leadership, international experiences, your tenacity, problem-solving abilities or examples of solving problems, and community and human connection. So
that sounds like a great list.
I've got a question about international. So is that you've exposed yourself to different cultures, or is that you like to just travel? Like what does international mean exactly?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's exposing yourself, but international exposure. International exposure, I put into a few categories. One is identity, and that means you're like binational, biracial, or fill in the gap with how many. You might have multiple passports. You grew up in a bicultural family. You've moved around, so kind of like grown up in different places. That's kind of like the identity piece. Another one is like professional. You might work for a multinational. Let's say you're in California, but you're working for an Indian company in California. So for sure you have at least like leadership coming from abroad, right? But you might be working with people in offices in different countries. Also, you might have clients, buyers, suppliers in the US. It's so big, different states, it's almost like a different culture in some places. So all these things play into it. And the third one is more like travel. For your own personal reasons, pleasure, you've traveled, you might have done volunteer experience abroad. I see a lot of that on people's resumes and applications. So all of these things play into the international exposure and having contact. And I think above all, what that creates and builds in people is empathy. It's very difficult to, on the most basic level, to hate somebody if you've experienced what their culture is like. You can relate to them. It's a very human thing. Now put it in the context of an MBA program, and you thought you have had diversity and inclusion training, and then you're suddenly in this high pressure situation with like 10 people, each from 10 countries, and you have a deadline of 3 hours to come up with something, and it's intense when you say something and you think it's clear, and the other 9 people in front of you think you're speaking, a Martian language. So that agility, learning how to restate things in a way that someone else might not have understood the first time you said it, being patient, working in a little bit more of ambiguity when you don't necessarily know. You can just accept that we get the concept, even though the nitty-gritty doesn't matter because we got to move on. We have a deadline. So all of those things, I think, are very not transferable, but very important skills to be able to work in a multinational environment.
Bara, I'm glad you raised the question about it. One of the ways that I would frame a similar but maybe different category is open-mindedness. So that can be showcased through travel and international experiences and a willingness to learn about others. One of the things I'm always cautious about is that not everybody can afford to go and volunteer in another country, for example. And when they're looking to build diverse classes, one of the things that's important is, again, that willingness to learn about others, like curiosity.
Mhm.
And that can sometimes happen very close to home. If we're and can be a way to showcase that trait. I agree with you, Eric. I think an international exposure and a willingness to put yourself out there in the world is a really tremendous way to showcase that skill. But I think there are also some other ways to do that as well.
Yeah. And if I was vague, I didn't mean to sound like all of those things are necessary. I think you
Right.
need to demonstrate some international
Mhm.
exposure, and it could be any of those things. Again, not everyone has the luxury to travel abroad. That's one thing.
Right.
Not everyone happens to have 3 passports.
Right.
So, but
But if
it,
you do, it's an asset, right? To your
it is
point, it's
absolutely an asset,
there
and
those
some people,
those things can be really valuable in an interview context for sure.
hundred
And
percent.
yeah.
I would also imagine like looking at one's own community and the diversity that exists in your community and how you engage with that would be a
Mm.
comparable, if not international. It's just like in my community, there's so many, even on nextdoor.com, right?
Yeah.
I can see that there's just such a there's so much diversity that's here
Yeah.
that how are you engaging just around you? Like you can find a world in your backyard, right? So if you don't have
I love that.
the option,
Yeah.
if you don't have the option of actually traveling internationally or even nationally, what do you do with what you got, right?
Mhm.
So that's
Exactly.
also going to speak volumes of who that person is.
Now, we all live in very international cities, Seattle, San Francisco, and Paris. Some places might be a little bit more homogenous. You might have to go that extra mile. Could be something online, perhaps, that you're building some kind of community online. I mean, that's kind of the direction things have been going. Uh, Volunteering in the metaverse.
Yep. Absolutely. I mean, it's amazing, right? The different ways in which we can connect with people now.
It's insane. It's cool.
Yeah.
So let's talk about something that I think is also troublesome. What to do about difficult questions? And either one of you wants to take the lead on that. When you get hit with that difficult question that you don't know how to answer, or maybe it even seems a bit aggressive. What do you think, Andrea?
Um, I think there's a couple of different kinds of well, there are many different kinds, obviously, of difficult questions. The ones where you feel like you're on the spot and you really don't know the answer, it's actually, I find okay to say, gosh, I don't know. That's part of why I want to come to business school. You're asking me about, Google's HR strategy and its impact on retention. I actually have no idea. I haven't thought about that before. I could tell you what my hypothesis is, but one of the things I'm cautious about is trying to go beyond my knowledge or capability set and asserting something that's just wrong. So happy to go from there, but blah blah, something like that.
Look
Um,
at what you just did there. I just want to point out, imagine you were asked that question, you sort of answered your own hypothetical question. First of all, you stayed cool under fire,
yeah.
right? You were humble, right? You didn't pretend to know more than you did, and
Mhm.
you were curious, or you portrayed that you will be curious and will follow up with doing the research, right? So there's a certain
Yeah.
responsibility that you take on. All of those things, I think, translate really, really well in the interview. We can't be expected to know everything,
No.
but knowing how to do research, knowing how to apply it and communicate that, all the while being cool and I mean, staying cool under pressure is what I mean. And
Yeah.
you've illustrated that very well.
Well, I was going to say, Eric, to that point, like if we go back to our fictitious Google question for a second, one of the things you could say is, the way that I would, given that I don't know, where I would start is, and then give them some context. So I might just Google the question, or I might I have friends who work at Google. I would reach out to them to understand, something, whatever the next steps are, that can be a way to do it. I I think the most difficult ones are the ones that catch people emotionally off guard. So if I said, let's say, Bara had something fairly tragic happen in her life in college and she took a year off. And I said, hey, Bara, tell me about this 5-year college trajectory. How did that happen? When you're in the middle of an interview and your emotions are already heightened, those kinds of things can surprise people. And what I would suggest in those situations in particular is owning whatever happens. So let's say out of the blue, Bara decides, well, doesn't decide, Bara starts just like the tears start coming, right? She remembers something about that time. You can, again, just pause and say, wow, I think I'm just really excited about this interview. It's brought up a lot of things for me. I will share with you that I had a really tough personal situation during that time. That's why I took the year off. It's not something that I typically talk with people about. And again, it goes back to, and at business school, I think I'm going to need to explore some of that to make sure that I am comfortable with even the most difficult, whatever it is. Those are the ones that I think people find the most difficult because they don't expect them.
That's really good. Good to think about. I think also in terms of preparation, thinking about any pain points that you might know you have. Most obvious thing is a gap in your employment or in your education. And if there's a reason behind it that's more than circumstance, that it's actually quite heavy or hard to talk about, you want to talk about it with somebody like a friend or a parent or whatever that you trust to get used to talking about it. And by the way, you do have a right to your own privacy. If there's something that really personal happened, you can sum it up. It was a personal thing that I need to do this for, help me out if there's a better way that you'd like to say that, my colleagues here, but you don't need to talk about something that's highly personal at all.
Absolutely. Yep.
What I love about this also is that it's modeling amazing leadership and an amazing education. And leadership involves education, right? So such a great, you're basically demonstrating on the spot how you can lead, right? If the leader doesn't know, they look for the information. They might say how they're going to find the information and that they will follow up. Exactly what Eric was noting that you were doing, Andrea. So,
Bara, are there, again, because this is one of your areas of expertise, I'm so curious if someone gets into a situation like that and they are nervous and they're feeling that anxiety rise, are there things that you suggest that people do to bring that back down?
Absolutely. In part, we want applicants to go into an interview with skills that get them to a place of the inner critic being fired, right? So part of it is making sure that the inner critic is fired prior to going into the interview. If they're in the interview and they notice that they're starting to feel that tension rise up, we teach them a technique called the backward spin, where they ride it. It can happen in just a few seconds. It's an NLP, a neuro-linguistic programming sequence.
Yeah.
And you notice it and then you push it in reverse. And you might even tell the person who's interviewing you, like, wow, I just want a name. I'm noticing that I'm starting to feel this thing. But it will only take a couple seconds. You push it in the other direction, and then you think of a time when you've had really inappropriate laughter. Like you're not laughing, but you are. And then you throw in that mix someone who you love. So you want to do this, you can just take a moment and there's other techniques. There's things called anchoring, that you anchor a feeling in your body, and you can squeeze that and that will bring you back to that place. Anything that's embodied, right? So if you can, there's dozens of techniques that you can do in the moment that the interviewer probably won't even notice that you're doing. But I think that naming it and sharing a human experience with someone is really something that breaks down barriers and breaks down walls and creates rapport. And so even just mentioning exactly what you said, which is like, wow, this is really important to me, and I'm noticing I'm triggered, and I just want to take a breath, right? That might even be something that can be useful and helpful.
All right, we have just a couple of minutes left. We are a little bit over already, so just want to open it up to any last suggestions, tips. Sorry about the noise in the background. My coffee machine a little crazy over there. Final.
That sounds like a great thing to happen at this time of day.
Right, exactly. It's again so meta. Today's the tech difficulty day on my side, anyway. No, final tips or suggestions, points that we didn't cover that you really want to mention. the floor is ours.
Thank you notes.
What's that? Oh, yes. Oh, goodness. Yeah. Yep. And don't stalk somebody to find their email to that end on thank you notes. If they specifically have not given you their email, don't try and track it down and be cute about it. It's sort of annoying. So it's finding the right avenue. You can always send a thank you note through the general admissions email box to say, could you please send this to Eric? I had such a great experience interviewing with him today. That's a double win because then you've complimented somebody on their team and you've sent the thank you note.
Nice one. Yeah, I find at the end of interviews, ask, is it all right to ask for your card? If it's in person.
Yep.
Also on the way out, if there's a receptionist or secretary or someone, you could ask, is it okay if I have the contact, or is there an email address I can send a thank you to? So allowing them to sort of direct you is a good one. Also, originally, Bara, what I had thought you said was taking notes, not thank you notes. But I was going to say taking notes is totally appropriate during the interview. Having a little pen and pad with you, whether in person or doing an online interview, particularly online, especially if there's multiple people, you want to make a note like, okay, blonde-haired person, that's Mary Jane, and brown-haired, that, just to keep track of who's who, so you can address people and thank them by name. That's always nice. And I want to really impress again on the point about asking questions. As you are interviewing them, you want to prepare at least 3 solid questions is kind of my rule of thumb. Of course, things that are not easily answered by the website or a brochure. You're at the interview stage. This is about as deep as you can go before being admitted, right? And so you want to have very thoughtful questions, and again, that are appropriate for the person you're talking to. So make sure you have that. And feel free to have those written down right next to you, just so you don't forget in a state of nervousness. And yeah, that thank you email, going back to that, I've gotten the thank you email within a couple hours after, to a day or two, I think is a good range. A couple hours to a couple of days, as you see fit. Anyway, any other final comments from my colleagues here?
I'm just, so to the point that I made on the thank you notes, one of the things I do talk with people about is to be very careful about stalking your interviewer before the interview. So relating to the point on questions, you want to be thoughtful in your questions. You don't want to say, gosh, Eric, when did you acquire your 3rd fish? Or something, right? Where that happens often, where people, when they're nervous, they want to spend time doing things that are comfortable, and people are really good at research. A lot of folks are, and finding things. That's part of their job. So you want to make sure that you don't overwhelm your interviewer by knowing too much about them.
Sorry about your divorce.
Yeah, exactly. Honestly, it's amazing how much information you can find about people online very quickly. So it's well-intentioned, right?
Yeah.
Like, Eric, I'm so interested in your love of bicycles or something, right? But it's, for the interviewer, it's coming from out of the blue. They don't expect that you will have been doing that. And so it just feels really weird and uncomfortable, not like you're someone who's done your homework, if that makes sense. So just to end it on a fun note from my end, but
absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, look.
Yes. Stalking, no.
Right.
Good rule of thumb. If you have any questions, call Bara. She's in San Francisco. She's happy to answer. So,
you'll make sure her number's available on the internet so that people can find her and all of the other details about her life.
Well, I will point out that all of our websites are available on this broadcast, and you can find our contact on the MBAwaves.com website. We're going to end it right there on a fun note. That was a great episode. Thank you so much, Bara, as well as Andrea, for joining us today. It was great talking to you both.
Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you, guys. This was really fun.
Yeah. Hope this is leaving you feeling more confident and prepared for the interviews. We're right in the middle of round 2. But whenever your interview is, whether later this spring or next year, this is really good information that pretty much will always be true. Next week, we're going to dive into a really interesting topic, as the new Financial Times rankings just came out 8 days ago. So it was Monday last week. And if it weren't for the pressing feeling that I had to talk about interviews today, I would have talked about that. So we're going to dive into that next week, doing a breakdown of the FT Global MBA or full-time MBA rankings. So be Be sure to join us next week live on LinkedIn or Facebook or YouTube. And thank you all so much for listening and joining us today.
Thank you.